Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be taking part in ADL's National Leadership Summit this year, which, as the previous speakers so powerfully made clear, could not be more urgently timely. Special thanks to Jonathan Greenblatt, Eileen Hirschenoff, and Daniela Reich for inviting me and organizing everything so perfectly. My topic is going to be a little bit broader than anti-Semitism. I'm going to be talking about political tribalism. And as we all know by now, America is in the grip of political tribalism. We lament and condemn this tribalism, even as we can't help voraciously engaging in it. But to solve any problem, we first need to correctly diagnose it and to understand its root causes. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to do my best to try to clarify those root causes, to explain why it is that America is so bitterly polarized today, why we're seeing such a marked increase in hateful rhetoric, violence, and extremism, and what we can do going forward to counter and reduce this tribalism. So let me start by saying that humans, like our fellow primates, are tribal animals. It's biological. We're hardwired that way. We need to belong to groups. And once we connect with a group, we tend to want to cling to it and defend it and see our group as better in every way. In a fascinating recent study, children between the ages of 4 and 8 were randomly assigned to either the red group or the blue group and asked to put on a t-shirt of corresponding color. They were then shown computer-edited images of other children on a computer, half of whom were wearing red t-shirts, the other half of whom were wearing blue t-shirts. And the children were asked for their reactions to these pictures. Even though they knew absolutely nothing about the children in their photos, the subjects consistently reported that they liked the children in their group better, wanted to allocate more resources to them, and perhaps most disturbingly, displayed strong unconscious bias. That is, when told stories about these kids, these subjects exhibited systematic memory distortion, tending to remember all the positive things about the children wearing their color and all the negative things about the children on the other side. So humans aren't just a little tribal. We're very tribal. And once we belong to a group, our identities can become oddly bound up with it. The effect is like a drug. We will seek to benefit our group mates even when we personally gain nothing. We will take pleasure when out-group members fail or suffer a misfortune. The studies actually show that our brains light up when we stick it to the other side. Now, tribalism is not necessarily a bad thing. Sports, for example, is a great example. Incredibly tribal, but it can be fun. Family can be very tribal. I'll be the first to admit that I'm a very tribal person. The problem is when tribalism takes over a political system. That's when things get dangerous, because then you start seeing everything through your group's lens, and facts and arguments and data don't matter. You just stick to your tribe no matter what, and you try to take down the other side. That's what we're seeing in America today. Why we can't get anything done. We can't even talk to each other. We're at the point where many Americans see people who voted for the other side, not just people they disagree with, but as immoral, evil, and un-American, which is a dangerous state of affairs. At the same time, we're seeing a fracturing and splintering within groups, within the left, within the right, with ever-dividing smaller and smaller groups pitting themselves against each other. So why? Why is this happening now? What is different about today? Well, two factors make this moment different. First is the massive demographic transformation this country is going through. For 200 years, America was dominated economically, politically, and culturally by a white majority. Now, obviously, white is a social construct, and who counted as white has always been a moving target. But basically, that's been the overall dynamic. Whites have been an overwhelmingly dominant majority for 200 years. Now, when one group is so overwhelmingly, unquestionably dominant, lots of terrible things can happen, because that group can oppress, it can persecute, and it can enslave with impunity. But it can also afford to be more generous, more enlightened, more inclusive, like the WASP elites of the 1960s, who voluntarily opened up the Ivy League colleges to more Jews, blacks, and other minorities, in part because it just seemed like the right thing to do. Today, things are very different. For the first time in US history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status at the national level. There's a lot of debate about this, but most estimates say that this will happen around 2044 or maybe 2050. Non-Hispanic whites are already a minority in Texas, California, Washington, D.C., and dozens of counties across the country. The result of this is that in America today, every group feels threatened. It's not just minorities who feel threatened, whites feel threatened. Over half of white Americans feel they are subject to more discrimination than minorities. And it's not just Republicans who feel this way. Because of affirmative action, various diversity policies, according to a recent Pew Foundation study, about 30% of Democrats believe there is some or a lot of anti-white discrimination in this country. It's not today just religious minorities like Jews or Muslims who feel threatened. Christians feel threatened today. You hear talk of the war on the Bible. With President Trump in the White House, women feel threatened. With the Me Too movement, men feel threatened. Straights and gays, Latinos and Asians all feel threatened. And when groups feel threatened, that's when they retreat into tribalism. That's when they close ranks and become more insular and defensive and more us versus them. That's why we are now seeing identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum. So on the right, as we've been hearing, we're seeing openly xenophobic white nationalist movements brazenly holding conferences and rallies and being covered by the mainstream press in a way that would have been shocking just 5 years ago. A central theme, as ADL's Eileen Hershenoff testified to Congress just last month, is that the white race is in danger of extinction, about to be drowned by a rising tide of non-white people who, the bizarre argument goes, are being controlled and manipulated by Jews. This is just what Joel was saying earlier and finding online. Meanwhile, on the left, there has been a sharp shift away from inclusivity as a watchword to a much more exclusionary approach. I see this so starkly on the college campus where I teach. Again, compared to even just 3 or 5 years ago, there's much more self-segregation by race, by ethnicity, by religion, by sexual orientation, a real hardening of group lines, less and less crossing over. Part of this is an epistemological phenomenon. The idea now is you can't understand, you can't share, out-group members cannot share in the knowledge produced or experienced by in-group members. So you hear things like, you can't understand me because you're white, or you can't speak for me because you're not Latino. The whole idea of cultural appropriation insists, among other things, that these are our group symbols, our traditions, our patrimony, and others have no right to them. Not long ago, when I was growing up, it was a sign of multicultural openness for a Caucasian to wear a sari or a kimono. Today, those would be acts of microaggression. Note, this is a huge change in the progressive movement. If you think of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s, or more recently, the international human rights movement of the 1990s or 2000s, their vision and their goals were framed in universalist, colorblind, inclusive terms. The goal was to transcend, not highlight group differences. And of course, as we just heard, there's an increasingly visible strand of anti-Semitism on the left too. So all that is the first factor. Because of the massive demographic changes we're seeing in this country, no group in America today feels comfortably dominant. Every group feels attacked, persecuted, pitted against other groups for jobs, spoils, university spots, and the right to define the nation's identity. But there is a second reason we're seeing these new political pathologies. And this has to do with a phenomenon that I've been writing about for 20 years. And this is the phenomenon of what I call market-dominant minorities, a term I coined in 2003 to refer to minorities that are viewed as outsiders by the rest of the population and that do, in fact, control vastly disproportionate amounts of a nation's wealth. So, for example, the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, they make up only 3% of the population, but they control up to 70% of the private economy. And that's not a stereotype, that is that's actually the case. That's also true of whites in South Africa, whites in Zimbabwe. Again, a small minority controlling vastly disproportionate amounts of the nation's economy. Now, incidentally, Jews in the United States today are not market dominant under this definition. They are, of course, among the most successful subgroups in America, but claims that they control the economy are just not true, and I've documented this. For example, the 3 richest men in America, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates, none of them are Jewish. The reason all this is important is that in countries with a market-dominant minority, democracy or majority rule can be extremely destabilizing. Americans tend to romanticize democracy. They think elections are the answer to everything. You have a problem, let's have some elections. But for 20 years, what I've been writing about in the context of developing countries is that under certain conditions, especially when inequality tracks deep pre-existing ethnic or religious divides, democracy doesn't ameliorate, but actually catalyzes group divides. Specifically, in developing countries where a small, hated minority is viewed as controlling the economy, democracy can easily become an engine of catastrophic ethno-nationalism, pitting a poor, resentful, long-oppressed majority, easily manipulated and aroused by power-seeking demagogues, against this market-dominant minority. And vivid recent examples of this include Indonesia, Zimbabwe, and Iraq. Now, it used to be practically a defining difference between the United States and the turbulent developing world that we didn't have a market-dominant minority. Just the opposite, as I mentioned. For most of our history, and this has brought its own problems, but we had really the opposite situation. America has been dominated economically and politically by a white majority, a politically highly stable, if also deeply invidious state of affairs. But today, something has changed. Class, or more specifically, education, has basically split America's white majority. Indeed, there is now so little interaction and intermarriage between urban, coastal whites and rural, heartland, southern whites, the people who voted for Donald Trump. There's so little interaction between those two groups of whites that the difference between them is practically what social scientists would call an ethnic divide. It is much more common for a white person who attended Georgetown or NYU or Columbia or Yale to marry someone South Asian or Nigerian than to marry someone from Appalachia. As a result, I think that what we're seeing is, really for the first time in our history, the emergence of America's own weird version of a market-dominant minority. It's not ethnic or religious, But this is the much discussed group often referred to as coastal elites. And that's a misleading term because these members of this group are neither all coastal or elites in the sense of being wealthy. But with some important caveats, coastal elites bear a disturbing resemblance to the market-dominant minorities of the developing world. It is, in fact, the case that wealth in the United States is extraordinarily concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people, primarily living on the West Coast and the East Coast. They dominate key sectors of the economy, including Wall Street, the media, Silicon Valley. Although America's coastal elites are not an ethnic or religious minority, they are culturally distinct, often sharing similar cosmopolitan values, pro-immigrant values, and they are extremely insular, interacting and primarily amongst themselves, intermarrying amongst themselves, living in the same cities, attending the same elite schools, and often viewed as arrogant and condescending by the rest of the country. Now note, coastal elites are not all white. As my former student J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, has pointed out, from the point of view of heartland America, the Harvard-educated, professorial-sounding Barack Obama is the classic arrogant coastal elite. Most important, because coastal elites are viewed by many in Middle America as minority-loving and pro-immigrant, caring more about the poor in Africa than they care about the poor in the United States. This group is seen as unconcerned with real Americans, indeed as threatening their very way of life. And of course, Jews fit conveniently right into this narrative, not just in the American alt-right, but in populist movements all over Europe. Jews are painted as disloyal globalists, the puppet masters behind immigration and multiculturalism. And what happened in the presidential election in America in 2016 is exactly what I would have predicted for a developing country pursuing elections in the presence of a resented market-dominant minority viewed as controlling the levers of power from afar. What we would have expected to see is just what we got: the rise of a populist movement in which demagogic voices called on real Americans to take back their country, to make America great again. And take back our country is exactly that exact rhetoric is what President Trump used. And it's extremely illuminating to see what's happening in the United States as part of a much larger pattern, captured historically in slogans like Malaysia for Malaysians, Zimbabwe for Black Zimbabweans, Serbia for the Serbs. So while it's true, as many have pointed out, that extremism in the United States has very strong parallels in Europe's populist movements, it's almost more important and troubling to see that for the first time in our history, the United States is starting to display destructive political dynamics much more typically associated with developing countries. Because of the two factors just described, the massive demographic change and the emergence of our own sort of idiosyncratic version of a market-dominant minority, we are starting to see in the United States the rise of ethno-nationalist movements, lurches towards authoritarianism, the erosion of trust in institutions and electoral outcomes, and above all, the transformation of democracy into an engine of zero-sum political tribalism. So, what can we possibly do about all this? What is the way forward? Well, to put it mildly, there are no easy solutions. I mean, telling someone to stop being tribal is like telling people to stop rooting for their sports teams and just loving all athletes. Tribalism has been around as long as humans. And again, it's a biological imperative. And anti-Semitism, more specifically, has been a plague for thousands of years. Needless to say, we do need strong law enforcement measures to try as best we can to curb and respond to hate crimes and extremist violence. And we've just heard heroic example of that today. ADL has been an absolutely leading voice on that front, perhaps the kind of litigation that Joel was referring to. But beyond legal responses, more foundationally, there is also evidence that tribalism can be tempered, not eliminated, but tempered. There is, in fact, a huge body of interdisciplinary research showing that if you can just have people from different tribes interact as human beings, astonishing progress can be made. Now, it's crucial. I'm not just talking about more diversity. In fact, mere exposure can often make things worse. It can actually make harden group divides. But what has been shown to be effective is real interaction as individuals. That is one-on-one human engagement. If you pull a Trump supporter and a Trump hater out of their tribes and just get them to interact as human beings, talk about their children, their hopes, their fears, it's amazing how often they can find common ground. And it is possible to do this on a large scale. The best example of this is the integration of the US military in the 1950s. So when President Truman first issued this order that the US troops were to be integrated, there was wild, intense opposition. Popular opinion was wildly against it. Even within the military, everyone was against it. But after they integrated the troops, the study showed that cooperation and effectiveness in the integrated groups was equal to or superior to the all-white units. And even more interestingly, the interviews that were conducted were incredibly inspiring. Young men from diverse backgrounds, all different races, found that when they were lying in their bunker, homesick, terrified, lost, bonds could be made. It didn't matter what accent people had, where they came from, true bonds were made. When your life depends on the person next to you, you don't care about the color of their skin. And there were a lot of terrible things about the Vietnam War, but one documented positive outcome is that soldiers from all different religious and ethnic backgrounds came to understand each other, reducing stereotyping and prejudice. So building on these kinds of examples, I think we need to promote and experiment with concrete initiatives designed to make Americans see others as fellow Americans. Specifically, to try to bridge this massive chasm between the coastal elites, basically all of us, and the heartland, this chasm that contributes to mutual ignorance, disdain, and stereotyping, I think we should seriously think about having some kind of national service program, perhaps right after high school. So if you think about it right now, it's very common for our children after high school to take a gap year. They almost always go they could go to Guatemala or Amsterdam, Australia, often with their same group of friends. And they do wonderful things there. They have a great experience. But what if young Americans from the coast were encouraged or even required to spend a year after high school, not abroad, but in unfamiliar parts of America? Not helping or teaching like Teach of America, which is a wonderful program, but not just helping other members of another group, but interacting with young people whom they would normally never cross paths with, ideally working together towards a common goal. And what's interesting about this idea is that it seems that lots of different people around the country are independently thinking of it. I remember having the idea and kind of writing it up, and then just totally coincidentally, Tim Wu, who writes for the New York Times op-ed page, emailed me to propose the exact same thing, and then somebody from the Brookings Institute emailed me. And then I have students almost every other day, not knowing that I'm interested in this, emailing me with long proposals about this. So I think it's possible that something like this could have traction. So I want to conclude by saying that I've always been an optimist, but it's just getting harder and harder to be that way. Every piece of news that comes out just makes it harder. So I wanted to end by recommending to you a book that I was recently asked to read and to blurb, and you may know of it, but it's an extraordinary book by Eli Saslow called Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. And it's about just all these terrifying things you've been hearing about. It's about a young man named Derek Black, whose godfather was David Duke, and Derek was being groomed to be the future of the white supremacist movement. His father founded Stormfront, one of the most virulently anti-Semitic and racist websites. Again, just what Joel was talking about. So this young man grew up steeped in the most disgusting forms of racism and anti-Semitism. He went off to college, and just as chance would have it, ended up rooming with a Peruvian immigrant and an Orthodox Jew. And he also ended up dating a young Jewish woman. And the story of his transformation is gripping and illuminating and ultimately incredibly uplifting. In a New York Times 2016 op-ed, he wrote about what got him to change. And he said, several years ago, I began attending a liberal college where my presence prompted huge controversy. Through many talks with devoted and diverse people there, people who chose to invite me into their dorms and conversations rather than ostracize me, I began to realize the damage I had done. Ever since, I have been trying to make up for it. It really is a beautiful tribute to the power of empathy and the possibility of change. In closing, I hope that I've given you some food for thought and perhaps even a tiny glimmer of hope. I commend and applaud all of you for participating in this leadership summit. I truly cannot think of anything more important or daunting than trying to tackle human hatred, and you all have my great admiration. It's been a privilege to address you, and thank you all very much.